tonight we are not talking about phones, not really. Tonight we are talking about quiet, the kind of quiet that once settled gently over Britain after sunset, not sudden, not dramatic, but natural. A quiet that arrived when streets emptied without being told to, when shop lights dimmed one by one, when windows glowed softly behind curtains and nothing demanded your attention. This is a story about Britain before screens, and how, without realizing it, we slowly built a world that never sleeps. But to understand that world, we must first return to an evening when the night still knew how to end. In Britain, for most of its history, the day had a clear boundary. When darkness arrived, life slowed. In London, after 9 in the evening, the streets thinned. Footsteps echoed longer on the stone. Buses passed less often. Shops closed not because of law, but because there was no reason to stay open. In Manchester, factory whistles had already fallen silent. The smoke of the day settled low between brick buildings. Workers returned home with tired bodies, but minds that were no longer being pulled in every direction. The night was not entertainment. It was rest. Inside homes, evenings followed simple rituals. Tea was poured slowly. Cups warmed cold hands. Newspapers were folded and refolded. Radios murmured quietly in the background, not shouting, not competing. Voices did not overlap endlessly. When someone spoke, others listened. Children finished homework at kitchen tables, not because they were monitored, but because there was nothing else fighting for their attention. When bedtime came, it came gently. Nothing followed them upstairs. You could hear things then. Clocks ticking, pipes cooling, a distant train moving through the dark. The world exhaled. Sleep arrived not because people were exhausted, but because the day had ended. This rhythm shaped generations. It shaped how people rested, how they thought, how children grew into adults without carrying the entire world in their pockets. And for a long time, no one questioned it, because silence did not feel like loss, it felt like balance. In medieval England, after the Great Plague had passed, cities became quiet out of necessity. In industrial Britain, quiet arrived through routine. Work ended, noise stopped. Darkness belonged to no one and to everyone at once. Even exhaustion had an ending. This matters more than it seems, because when nights end naturally, minds learn how to rest. And when minds can rest, childhood unfolds slowly, without urgency, without interruption. But history never stays still. Change does not arrive loudly. It arrives politely. And one evening, without anyone noticing, the night began to stretch a little longer. As the evening deepened, Britain did not rush toward the night. It drifted. Darkness arrived slowly, and people moved with it, as if the day itself had decided it was time to rest. In towns and cities, lamps flickered on one by one, not to entertain, but simply to mark the passage of time. Shadows lengthened along brick walls. The noise of traffic softened. The world became smaller, and in that smaller world people felt contained. In London, upper floors glowed with warm, uneven light. Curtains were drawn half away, never fully closed, never fully open. Inside, families settled into evenings that repeated themselves night after night, year after year. Repetition was not boredom, it was stability. People knew what the evening would bring, and because they knew, they did not feel the need to search for more. The radio spoke in measured tones. Newsreaders did not rush. Music did not overwhelm. Silence was allowed to exist between words. If a program ended, nothing replaced it immediately. The gap remained. and in that gap minds wandered quietly without being pulled in any direction. In Manchester and other industrial cities, the contrast between day and night was even clearer. Daytime belonged to machines, night belonged to people. After work, boots were placed by doors, jackets were hung carefully, as if tomorrow could wait. Meals were simple, nothing was photographed, nothing was shared beyond the room, conversations were not interrupted. When someone paused, the pause stayed. Children learned these rhythms without instruction. They did not need rules to stop scrolling. There was nothing to scroll. The evening taught them quietly that energy had limits. Homework ended, play ended. The day closed itself. By the time sleep arrived, their minds were already slowing, already prepared. You could feel it in the air, a sense that nothing urgent remained undone. Even worries behaved differently then. They waited. They did not chase. Concerns about money, about work, about the future stayed within their boundaries. They did not follow people into bed. This was not a perfect world. Life was hard. Work was tiring. Cities were crowded. But the mind was not constantly summoned. Attention was not harvested. No invisible system asked for more time, more focus, more presence. The night asked only one thing, to be left alone, and for a long time Britain agreed. The night remained a place of ending, not continuation. A closing door, not an open window, but history, as it always does, was already moving quietly forward, not to disrupt, not to announce itself, just to extend the evening by a little. For a long time, evenings in Britain repeated themselves so faithfully that change felt unnecessary. The rhythm worked. Days opened, days closed, and in between, life found a balance that did not need improvement. But history rarely asks for permission. It does not arrive with announcements. It does not interrupt. It extends. At first, the evening simply grew longer, not suddenly, not noticeably. A program ended a little later than usual. A shop stayed open just a bit past its normal hour. Street lamps remained lit for longer. People did not question it. Why would they? The night still felt calm, still familiar, still safe. Only now it lingered. Inside homes, new habits began to form quietly. The radio stayed on a little longer. The television, when present, offered more than it once had. Schedules became flexible. If one program ended, another followed. The silence between them grew shorter. Not gone, just thinner. People welcomed this change. It felt like comfort, like choice. After long working days, the idea of extending the evening did not feel like disruption. It felt like relief. No one spoke about attention. No one spoke about rest. They spoke about convenience. Children noticed the difference first. Bedtime softened. Rules bent slightly. Just one more became a phrase spoken without concern. The night no longer closed itself. It needed help, and help was gladly given. Still, sleep came easily. The mind adjusted. The evening was longer, but not louder. The world had not yet learned how to follow people into their private spaces. Homes were still protected by distance. What existed outside stayed outside. In cities like London and Manchester, the change felt subtle. Factories still rested at night. Streets still emptied, but inside light stayed on, not bright, just present. Rooms glowed longer than they once had. This was not the loss of quiet, it was the reshaping of it. Silence was still possible, but it required intention. And intention, once required, slowly becomes optional. No one could have predicted where this would lead. Because nothing felt wrong. There were no alarms, no warnings, just an evening that did not quite know when to end. and a night that waited patiently, while the world learned how to stay awake just a little longer. As evening stretched, something else arrived quietly beside them, not as a disruption, not as a demand, but as an addition. Homes did not suddenly change. They accumulated. A device here, a cable there. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt invasive. At first, the evening still belonged to the household, but it began to borrow time from elsewhere. Voices from outside the room found their way in. News travelled faster than it once had. Not shouted, just present. The world felt closer, without feeling heavy. Distance shrank gently. Inside living rooms, people sat longer, stayed awake without noticing. If the radio once rested, now it waited. If a program once ended, another followed without pause. The night did not close itself. It lingered politely. Children sensed the shift, even if they could not name it. Stories extended, bedtime drifted, sleep was delayed, but not resisted. There was still trust that rest would come when needed. Parents welcomed the convenience. After long days, having the world arrive effortlessly felt like a gift. No effort, no travel, no waiting. Information moved faster than footsteps, yet the home still felt separate, protected. What arrived inside did not stay. It passed through. Nothing followed anyone upstairs. Nothing waited beside the bed. The boundary remained, just thinner. In cities the effect was subtle. Streets stayed quiet. Factories still slept. But indoors the evening stretched wider. Lights stayed on. Conversations lasted. Attention lingered. Not captured, just extended. At this stage nothing felt wrong. There was no sense of loss, no feeling of intrusion, only the sense that time had become more flexible, and flexibility, when it first appears, feels like freedom. The night accepted this change, patiently, as it always does. And history, unnoticed, took another small step forward. At some point, the evening stopped being something that simply lasted. It began to expect, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently. Inside homes, people no longer waited for the night to end on its own. They waited for something else, a sound, a signal, a familiar presence that filled the room without requiring effort. The quiet was still there, but it no longer stood alone. It shared space. Evenings became shaped not by time, but by availability. If something could arrive, it was allowed to arrive. If it continued, it was allowed to continue. The night adapted. For adults, this felt harmless, comfortable. After work, after meals, after conversation slowed, there was something ready. Not demanding attention, but offering it. Waiting. The mind did not need to wander anymore. It could remain occupied, without effort, without decision. This felt like rest. Children experienced it differently. They did not recognize the shift as convenience. They felt it as presence, something that stayed with them, quietly, even when nothing else was happening. The evening no longer signaled an ending, it suggested continuation. Bedtime did not disappear. It softened. Sleep did not vanish. It waited. Parents trusted this new rhythm. Why wouldn't they? The home was still safe. The streets were still quiet. Nothing had followed anyone outside. The world arrived, but it did not stay. Or so it seemed. In bedrooms, lights remained on longer, not bright, not restless, just present. The sense of urgency had not arrived yet, but the sense of completion had faded. The day no longer felt finished when night arrived. It felt paused. This pause changed something subtle. When nights no longer closed themselves, minds learned to stay slightly open. Thoughts lingered. Attention hovered. Rest still came, but it arrived later and left earlier. No one noticed. There was nothing to notice yet. Cities remained quiet. Factories slept. Roads emptied. The outside world still respected darkness. But inside, the night had changed its role. It was no longer an ending. It was a container, holding whatever was ready to fill it. This was the moment history rarely marks. Because nothing breaks, nothing collapses. Life continues, just differently. The evening waits, the night listens. And attention, for the first time, does not drift. It stays. At first, nothing followed anyone. The evening arrived, stayed, and eventually faded. But slowly, very slowly, something learned to remain. It did not announce itself. It did not demand space. It simply stayed where it was, even when the room grew quiet. The home had always been a place of separation. What happened outside ended at the door. Now that boundary softened again. Not broken, just less certain. Information no longer waited to be invited. It was ready. When the room went still, it remained present. Not loud, not urgent, available. The evening no longer needed to be shaped. It shaped itself. And the night, once empty, began to feel occupied. Adults adapted easily. They had known other changes, other adjustments. This felt small, manageable. Something to fill the quiet moments after conversation ended. A way to remain connected without leaving the room. Nothing felt taken, only added. Children experienced something different. For the first time, the night was no longer separate from the day. What existed earlier did not disappear. It waited. Even in stillness, something remained close. The sense of being alone with one's thoughts became less familiar. Bedrooms changed first, not in appearance, but in feeling. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, as if something unseen was present, even when nothing was happening. Sleep adjusted, it did not resist. It adapted, but it became lighter. Thoughts lingered longer, minds rested less deeply. Morning arrived sooner than expected. No one connected these moments. There was no reason to. Outside, Britain still slept. Streets were dark, windows dimmed. Cities respected the night. But inside, the night had learned a new role. It was no longer a pause. It was a holding space. A place where attention could wait, even when nothing else asked for it. This was not a crisis. There were no headlines, no debates, no warnings, just a small change in presence. And history, once again, moved forward without asking to be noticed. Over time, the change stopped being subtle. Not because it grew louder, but because it became familiar. What once felt optional began to feel expected. Evenings no longer asked what the household needed. They arrived already filled. For adults, this felt efficient. Time was used. Silence was avoided. The day did not end abruptly. There was always something to soften the transition between activity and rest. Children were present for this, even when no one noticed. They did not experience the change as convenience. They experienced it as atmosphere. The night no longer felt separate. It felt continuous. What happened earlier in the day did not dissolve. It followed. Thoughts stayed active. Attention remained lightly engaged. The feeling of emptiness, once normal, became unfamiliar. Being alone with nothing started to feel unusual. Bedrooms absorbed this shift quietly. Lights went off, but presence remained. The room was dark yet not empty. The mind did not fully release the day. It carried fragments forward. Sleep still arrived, but it arrived negotiated. Rest was no longer the default. It was an outcome. Parents noticed tiredness, but not its source. Children woke more slowly. Mornings felt heavier. No single cause could be named. Nothing obvious had changed. Outside, Britain still followed its old rhythm. Streets emptied, cities darkened. The country rested as it always had. But inside homes, the night had lost its finality. It no longer belonged to itself. It belonged to whatever was ready to continue. This was the moment the change settled in. Not as disruption, not as conflict, as normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. By the time people began to notice, the change was already settled. Nothing dramatic had happened. No moment stood out. Life continued as it always had. But tiredness appeared more often, quietly, without complaint. Sleep felt lighter. Mornings arrived sooner than expected. Even after rest, the mind did not feel fully clear. These things were easy to explain away. Work was demanding. Life was busy. Britain had never been gentle. Fatigue blended into routine. But this tiredness felt different. It did not come only from effort. It came from presence, from the sense that the day had never fully let go. Children showed it first, not in behaviour, but in pace. They moved more slowly in the mornings. Their attention drifted more easily. Nothing serious, nothing alarming, just a subtle heaviness that followed them into the day. Teachers noticed it. Parents noticed it. But no one connected it to the night. The night had always been there. Evenings still looked calm, lights dimmed, houses grew quiet. But when children went to bed, the house did not settle. It waited. Silence no longer felt complete. It felt occupied. There was still no urgency. Britain does not rush to judgment. Change is accepted first, understood later. People spoke of modern life, of busy schedules, of how things were now. These explanations felt enough for the moment. At the edges of conversation, questions began to form. Why did rest no longer feel complete? Why did evenings feel full but unsatisfying? The questions stayed quiet. They had no language yet. The night still appeared normal, but it no longer belonged entirely to rest. Something followed into it. And once that happens, the boundary is never quite the same. Eventually the questions found their way into the open. Not all at once, not loudly. They appeared in careful language, in measured conversations, in small observations shared between adults. People began to ask whether the night was still doing what it once had, whether children were resting or only stopping. These questions were not accusations. They were concerns, quiet ones. Britain has always been cautious with change. When something feels uncertain, the first instinct is not to ban, but to understand. Parents spoke about evenings that no longer felt like endings. Teachers spoke about tired minds, not misbehaviour. Doctors spoke about sleep that arrived, but did not settle. No one blamed children. Children were simply present in a world that no longer knew how to close itself. Slowly, the idea of boundaries returned, not as punishment, not as fear, as memory. The memory that evenings once ended, that nights once protected rest without being asked. The suggestion was simple. Perhaps the night should not be endlessly available. Perhaps childhood should not carry the full weight of connection. These thoughts did not arrive as laws. They arrived as discussions, as proposals, as questions about limits. What should wait? What should stop? What should belong only to the day? The language was careful, the tone restrained, no urgency, no alarm, just the recognition that something quiet had shifted too far. This was not a rejection of progress. It was a pause, a moment to ask whether constant presence had replaced necessary absence, whether attention had lost its natural resting place. History often moves in circles. What was once enforced by routine must later be protected by choice. What was once natural must later be remembered. Britain had reached another such moment, not of crisis, but of correction. And so the night was reconsidered, not as entertainment, not as extension, but as boundary, a space meant to end the day, not continue it, a place where children could leave the world behind, without effort, without intention. This story has no sharp ending, only a quiet return to an old question. What should follow us into the night, and what should not? For a long time, the answer was simple, and perhaps, in remembering it, the night may once again learn how to end. Now there is nothing more to follow. The day has ended. The night does not ask for attention. You do not need to think. You do not need to remember. Let the thoughts slow. Let the silence return. If sleep comes, let it come naturally. Nothing is required of you now. Good night.